Snow on the summit, a ring of tall figures standing in air so thin it burns the lungs, their breath freezing into mist above the highest ground in the region. Now imagine that not one of them was born of a woman, and not one of them belonged on the earth. This is the story of the banquet on Mount Hermon, the night 200 fallen beings corrupted humanity. There is a detail hidden in the name of that mountain, a meaning carved into the syllables themselves, and you will understand it only when you reach the moment of the oath. There is also a body of knowledge that changed the world forever, knowledge no human hand had ever held, and you will see exactly what it was and what it cost. Hold both of those threads. The ancient texts pull them tight, one by one, until nothing on the ground below was ever the same. Stand on that summit and feel where you are. Mount Hermon rises 2,814 meters above sea level, a wall of limestone and snow that anchors the border between three modern nations. For nearly 6 months of the year, its crown is buried under white. The temperature on the upper ridge falls far below freezing through the long winter, and the wind moves across the exposed rock with nothing to stop it. This is not a gentle hill. It is the tallest thing for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, and from its peak the entire land spreads out beneath you like a map. If you wanted a throne to look down on all of humanity, you would choose exactly this place. And that, according to the oldest accounts, is precisely why it was chosen. The story does not begin in the book of Genesis, though Genesis carries its shadow. It is told in full, in a far older and stranger text, the Book of First Enoch, a work so ancient that fragments of it were buried in the caves above the Dead Sea more than 2,000 years ago. Picture the scene the text describes. In those days, the population of the earth was multiplying, and among the daughters of men were faces of striking beauty. The Watchers, the order of heavenly beings assigned to observe the world from above, looked down, and they wanted what they saw. One of them was named Semjazar, and he was their leader. He gathered the others and laid bare his desire, and then he hesitated because he understood the weight of it. The text records his exact fear in a single sentence. He told them he was afraid that he alone would pay the penalty for so great a sin, so he demanded that they all share the guilt equally. He demanded an oath. 200 of them agreed. Count that number and let it settle. 200 beings of the heavenly order, not a handful of rebels, not a single rogue, but an entire company organized like an army. The text divides them into ranks, 20 leaders each commanding 10, a chain of command as deliberate as any legion Rome would ever field. They descended together, and the place they came down, in the days of a man named Jared, was the peak of Mount Hermon. Now you arrive at the first thread. The text says they bound themselves by a mutual curse, swearing together that none would turn back, that all would carry the crime as one. And the mountain took its name from that act. In the ancient language, the word for the ban, the curse, the thing devoted to destruction, sounds in the very name, Hermon. The summit was christened by the oath sworn upon it. Every traveler who has spoken that name across the centuries has, without knowing it, repeated the memory of a curse. The mountain is a tombstone with the crime engraved on its face. This was the banquet, not a feast of food, but a gathering, a covenant, a binding. 200 immortal beings standing in a circle on the roof of the world, swearing an unbreakable pact to do the one thing they had been forbidden to do. They crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, the line between the order of heaven and the dust of the earth. And then they came down into the villages. Consider what that meant for the people below. These were beings of immense power and presence, descending among farmers and shepherds, among families who worked the land with their hands and measured wealth in goats and grain. The Watchers took wives for themselves, each choosing as he pleased. To the people of that age, it must have seemed at first like a blessing, like gods walking among them. They had no framework to refuse it. They had no idea what was being planted in their midst. What came next was the knowledge. This is the second thread, and it is the heart of why the ancient world remembered this night as the moment humanity was poisoned. The Watchers did not merely take wives, they taught. And what they taught was every art that human beings were not yet ready to hold. There was one among them named Azazel, and the text singles him out above all others. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. Read that list slowly. Before that night, the accounts suggest the working of metal into weapons of war was not a craft anyone possessed. Azazel placed it into human hands in a single generation. He taught them to dig out the metals of the earth and to work them, to forge the very instruments of slaughter. And he did not stop at weapons. He taught the making of bracelets and ornaments, the use of antimony to darken the eyes, the beautifying of the eyelids, the use of the costliest stones and all manner of dyes. He taught vanity and violence in the same breath, the blade and the painted face, and the world was transformed. War and seduction handed down from the same teacher on the same mountain in the same season. The others taught too, and each one opened a door that should have stayed shut. One named Amazarak taught the casting of spells and the cutting of roots, the dark pharmacology of poisons and potions. Almaros taught how to break enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology, the reading of fate in the stars. Kokabiel taught the meaning of the constellations. Ezekiel taught how to read the clouds, Arakiel the signs of the earth, Shamsiel the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. Layer upon layer of forbidden science, the manipulation of nature, the reading of destiny, the bending of the unseen world to human will. Measure the scale of this in the span of perhaps a single human lifetime. A civilization that had lived in relative simplicity was handed metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, pharmacology, astrology, and sorcery all at once, by teachers who could not be questioned and could not be matched. It was not progress earned slowly across centuries. It was a flood of power dumped onto a people who had no wisdom prepared to carry it. The earth filled with violence. That is the phrase the texts use, and the weapons explain it. Give untested hands the sword before they have learned restraint. And the result writes itself in blood. But the weapons and the spells were not even the worst of it. The worst of it was born 9 months after the banquet. Follow what the Union produced. The children of the Watchers and the daughters of men were not ordinary children. The text calls them giants, and the description it gives is staggering. In the oldest manuscripts of the book of 1st Enoch, the height of these offspring is given as 300 cubits. Translate that figure and brace yourself. 300 cubits is roughly 135 meters of standing height, taller than almost any structure the ancient world ever raised, a creature that would dwarf a 30-story building. Later copyists, perhaps unable to believe their own scrolls, reduced the number in some versions. But the original claim stands in the manuscript tradition, and whatever the true scale, the meaning is unmistakable. These were not men. They were something monstrous, something that had no place in the created order, and they were hungry. Picture the burden of feeding them. The accounts describe the giants consuming everything the people could produce. They devoured the harvests, the herds, the fish, the birds, until the labor of entire communities could not fill them. Imagine working the land from before dawn until the light failed, and watching a single one of these creatures consume in a day what would have fed a village for a season. The granaries emptied, the flocks vanished, and when the food of men ran out, the texts say, the giants turned on the people themselves. They began to consume human flesh, and then they began to consume one another. They drank blood, famine, slaughter. The land hollowed out from the inside. This is the human cost, and it must not be passed over quickly because it is the true center of the tragedy. Put yourself among the ordinary people of that age, the ones who never stood on the mountain and never swore the oath. You did nothing. You planted, you harvested, you raised your children. And then the world bent around you into a nightmare you could not escape. Your food was taken. Your sons were armed with weapons that taught them to kill their neighbors. Your daughters were carried off. Your fields were trampled by creatures the size of cliffs. There was no army that could resist a being 100 meters tall. There was no wall that could keep out what could step over it. There was nowhere to run, because the corruption was not at the border. It was in the marriage bed, in the forge, in the apothecary, in the temple of the stars. It was everywhere. The strong took whatever they wanted because the watchers had taught them how. The earth was filled with cruelty because cruelty had been given tools. And a people who had once measured a hard year by a poor harvest now measured survival in whether they would be eaten before morning. Weigh that despair. There was no human solution. The disaster had come from above, and only from above could it be answered. And the cry went up. The text says the earth itself and the souls of the slaughtered raised a voice to the gates of heaven. The dying lifted their suffering upward because there was no other direction left to look. Heaven heard. 4 of the great archangels are named as the ones who looked down and saw the ruin, who saw the blood spilled upon the earth and the lawlessness done beneath the sky. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel carried the cry of humanity before the throne of the Most High. They described what they had seen. They named what the watchers had done, the secrets revealed, the women defiled, the giants born, the earth drowned in blood. And they asked what should be done. The answer came as judgment, and it fell in deliberate order. First, Azazel. Because he had taught the secrets that armed the world, his sentence was the harshest and the most specific. The archangel Raphael was sent to bind him hand and foot and to cast him into the darkness. The text names the place, a desert called Dudael, where he was thrown into a pit, covered with jagged rocks, and sealed in darkness to remain until the day of the great judgment. The whole earth, the text says, had been corrupted through the works that Azazel taught, and so the whole blame for that knowledge was laid upon him, bound in the dark, sealed under stone, waiting. Then the giants. They could not be allowed to continue, but their judgment carried a terrible elegance. The archangels were sent to set them against one another, to make them destroy themselves in mutual war, until none remained. The creatures that had consumed the earth were turned to consuming each other. And the spirits that came out of their dying bodies, the texts add in a chilling note, did not depart. They remained on the earth as unclean spirits, restless and homeless, a haunting that the ancient world believed lingered long after the bodies fell. Then the watchers themselves, Semjaza and the 200 who swore the oath, were not granted death because they were not mortal. They were bound. The text gives the term of their imprisonment as 70 generations, locked beneath the hills of the earth, forced to witness the destruction of their own children, denied the death they might have begged for, sealed away until the final judgment at the end of all things, and then the cleansing. The corruption had soaked too deep into the world to be scrubbed out by anything less than total. The waters were called. The book of Genesis records the verdict in its own austere language, that the days of man would be 120 years, and that the flood would come to wipe the slate of the earth clean. The same Genesis chapter, the 6th, verses 1 through 4, preserves the seed of the whole account in a few compressed lines. The sons of God who took wives from the daughters of men, and the Nephilim who were on the earth in those days. The mighty men of renown. Genesis says it in a whisper. The book of 1 Enoch says it in a scream. The flood came, the water rose, and the world of the banquet was drowned. But here is what makes this story refuse to die. It did not stay buried with the world it destroyed. Walk forward across the centuries to the caves above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, near the ruins called Qumran. In the middle of the 20th century, in a series of discoveries that reshaped the study of the ancient world, scholars recovered fragments of the book of 1 Enoch among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Aramaic copies found their date to roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era, which means this account of the Watchers and the mountain was being read, copied and treasured more than 2,000 years ago in the same era that shaped the world the New Testament was born into. This was not a medieval invention. It was ancient long before anyone alive today drew breath. The story reached even further. In the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Book of 1st Enoch was never set aside at all. It remains part of the scriptural canon to this day, preserved in the Ge'ez language across more than 1,000 years. A living text in a living church while the rest of the world forgot it. And it left its fingerprints inside the New Testament itself. The brief letter of Jude, near the very end of the Christian scriptures, speaks in its 6th verse of the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but abandoned their own habitation, and who are now kept in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. That is the sentence of the Watchers, repeated almost word for word. A few lines later, in its 14th verse, Jude quotes Enoch by name directly. The 2nd letter of Peter, in its 2nd chapter, echoes the same image of angels cast down and held in chains of gloom. The memory of Mount Hermon was carried forward into the foundational texts of a faith that would spread across the entire world. There is one more thread, and it ties the mountain to the Gospels in a way that is hard to forget. At the southern foot of Mount Hermon, in the time of the New Testament, stood a city called Caesarea Philippi, built around a deep cave and a spring that the ancients believed was a gateway to the underworld, a place dedicated to dark powers, sometimes called the gates of hell. The Gospels record that it was there, in the very shadow of the cursed mountain, that one of the most pivotal conversations of the New Testament took place. Stand in that geography and the choice of location stops feeling like an accident. Now bring the threads together, the way the texts intended. The name of the mountain held a curse, and you have seen the oath that earned it. The forbidden knowledge changed the world forever, and you have seen exactly what it was, the sword and the spell and the painted eye, handed to a people who were not ready. The offspring turned against their own makers and against the world, and you have seen the famine and the slaughter they brought. 2 threads opened on a snowbound summit, and both have closed in blood and water and chains. The waters of the flood receded, and the world that rose from the mud carried no giants and no walking watchers, only the human race, smaller and chastened, beginning again. The physical horror was ended. But the deeper claim of the ancient account is that something was set loose on Hermon that a flood could not fully drown, a knowledge of how to corrupt, a memory of how the line between heaven and earth was crossed, and a warning fixed in the very name of a mountain. The thread that runs from that frozen peak does not end at the flood. It runs through the buried scrolls of the Dead Sea, through the canon of an ancient African church, through the warnings of the New Testament writers, and it surfaces of all places in the shadow of the same mountain where a teacher from Galilee once stood before the gates that the old world feared most. The story was meant to be answered. The texts that remember the fall on Hermon are the same texts that point with documentary insistence toward the moment that fall was confronted. A curse was sworn on a summit, and the long arc of the record bends toward the place where that curse was meant to be undone. That is the strange power of this account. It is not finally a story about angels who fell. It is a story about a wound opened at the top of the world, and about how every generation since has lived downstream of it, reading the warning whether they know it or not. The mountain still stands. The snow still falls on it for half the year. And the name it has carried for thousands of years still means, in the oldest tongue, the curse that was sworn upon its peak. Some oaths outlast the ones who swear them.